Why do we need to study chemistry? So chemistry is the study of matter and its transformation that it undergoes. And so this is an important part. There's chemistry all around us. It's inside your body in terms of biochemistry, but it's also in your technology. Our understanding of chemistry helps us drive through new technologies, whether that's solar energy, windmills, the silicon boom, right? So the whole microchip revolution. The reason why we can make microchips as small as we can has to deal with the chemistry behind them. The Bronze Age, the Copper Age, the Steel Age, that all comes from an understanding of chemistry. We see that whether that's from our food sciences like Twinkies, to our pharmaceuticals, to making steel and iron and cement, or even our green energy. And so before we start talking about that, we want to start to come up with some definitions. So the first one is we want to talk about matter. Now we might use this term, and so matter is anything that has space or that has mass and occupies space. So if you exist and you take up space and you have a mass to you, then you are going to be matter. Things that aren't matter are things like energy, so things like light or heat, not really matter. But whether you're a gas, whether you're a liquid, whether you're a solid, those are all matter. Now, those can be further separated into two categories. They can be split into mixtures or pure substances. Pure substances is when you have only a single type of matter present. So that might be you have water, or it could be the same element. You might have just aluminum metal. A mixture means that you have two or more of those pure substances and that they're mixed together or intermingled. So that could be something like air. Air is a whole mixture of materials. It could be something like a chocolate chip cookie. Inside those mixtures, we can further separate those into what we call a homogeneous mixture and a heterogeneous mixture. Now, a homogeneous mixture means that your composition is the same throughout. It means that it's very uniform, whereas a heterogeneous mixture means that it's not the same. So when we think about my example, air looks a lot like a homogeneous mixture. When we look through air, it generally looks the same throughout, whereas our chocolate chip cookie looks like a heterogeneous mixture. You can distinctly see where you have chocolate and where you don't have chocolate, right? That's not as evenly spread. Solutions are another name for a homogeneous mixture. We think of them as being solids mixed with our liquids, but that's not always the case. And solutions are actually a really important part of chemistry. There's a whole chapter, chapter 12, where we're going to talk about our solutions. So inside of matter, we have two more terms that we're going to introduce. The first one is elements. So your elements are kind of like your basic building block of matter. As a pure substance, they can't get any simpler than that. We can't break them down into different materials past that part. So it's your elements. So if you wanted to look at this picture up here, you can imagine that your elements are kind of like each Lego color. Red, blue, orange, yellow, right? Those are the things that we're using to build up our pieces. Atoms, on the other hand, is the smallest possible piece of that element. So that would be like a 1x1 block here of that green. That's an atom of the green element. It's the smallest Lego piece that we can go. This blue block with the 4, that's still just one element, blue, but it's 4 atoms put together. Now, a way to tell quickly whether you have an element or a substance is all of your elements are going to be listed on your periodic table. So there's been 118 of them identified. If you happen to find one that's not listed on the periodic table, that's going to be amazing, and we will probably become famous for finding a new element. But that's one way. So if you're not sure, if you're looking at it and you're like, is yttrium an element or is it a material or like a compound? Then what you can do is you can look on your periodic table and see if you can find that. 82 of them occur naturally, 36 of them we've actually created. So we haven't been able to find them in nature, but we have been able to manufacture them. A significant number of those ones that have been created have actually happened quite close to us over at the Berkeley National Labs. Elemental substances are going to be pure substances that are only made up of one element. So in this case, I'm showing you an example of nitrogen gas. Nitrogen is made up of two sets of this, nitrogen gas is made up of 2 atoms of nitrogen stuck together. And so you can kind of see in this visual that it's all just this blue color. the same element throughout that whole material. Things like gold metal are another example of an elemental substance. Compounds mean that we have two pure substance, or sorry, that we have a pure substance made up of two or more different elements. So in this case, our water, H2O, is made up of hydrogen and it's made up of oxygen. So we have two elements in there, we have two different colors, and so it's an example of a compound. It's still a pure substance because it's just one material, but it has two elements inside, so it's called a compound. Now this chemical formula down below is really a foundational part of chemistry. We're going to talk about them a lot more. But it's kind of like the recipe of our compounds. It's the recipe of our elemental substances as well. But it tells us the number of atoms of each element that we use to make up the smallest piece of that compound. And so we're going to get into that a little bit later, but I just wanted to introduce that term. So when we talk about chemical formulas of things, we're talking about what that composition is. So what I want you to do is take a moment and I want you to create a diagram. And in that diagram, we should show how these are all connected: matter, pure substances, mixtures. And so your diagram, it might be a hierarchy. It might look something like this. It could be a Venn diagram with different circles. It's up to you about how you want to visualize this information. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can come up with something that makes sense to you for your diagram. So go ahead and pause the video and you can move on to that part, draw out your diagram, and then you can restart it. Now the diagram that I chose looked like this. I like to have my big circle with all of my matter inside, and then inside that circle I can separate into my pure substances and my mixtures. Now those are very different, so I keep them apart because you either have one substance or you have more than one substance. There's not really any confusion there, so there's no overlap. Inside my pure substances, I have two separate categories: elemental ones and compounds. And then in my mixtures, I can separate those further into heterogeneous and homogeneous. Now, the reason why I have those two kind of touching is because heterogeneous mixtures and homogeneous mixtures can become a little bit complicated because it all depends on the scale that you view things at. If you look at your, like a picture of sand, from far away, your sand might look homogeneous. It might be a perfect white sand beach, and it looks the same. But when you get up close inside that beach, you might start to notice that your sand isn't uniform throughout. You have parts, you have grains that are black, you have grains that are brown, you have other things mixed in there. And so when we talk about heterogeneous and homogeneous, the scale of things does come into play. Are you looking at this under a microscope, or are you looking at it just with your naked eye? And so there is some confusion in that sometimes. Now, what I'll say for our class is we're trying to make it pretty straightforward. I'm not trying to trick you with our examples of our mixtures. And so one of the things to look for is if something is well mixed, then you're going to have a homogeneous mixture. And the reason for that is that a homogeneous mixture means that it's the same throughout. And if you're well mixed, that means that you're going to be the same throughout. So that's like a key word to look for in that. The other one is sometimes you don't want to overthink things. So if I tell you that you have a chocolate chip cookie, then you can think, well, could I see the different chocolate chips? And then you could think of that as being your homogeneous one. You could also think of that like if you have a Coca-Cola with ice cubes, right? Your ice cubes are definitely going to be separate from your Coca-Cola. You can see that. And so that's a heterogeneous mixture. Whereas if I said that you have a slushy, or Coca-Cola slushy, then you can think of that as being homogeneous because your ice has been evenly broken through with all of that Coca-Cola. And so it's the same throughout. Okay? So that's one way to think about it. Another diagram that you might have shown might look like this. And the nice part about this, what your book includes, is that it tells you how you can separate them to kind of get you some information about that. Mixtures can be separated by physical means. That means that you can physically pull apart the different pieces and then to get them into the different substances. And so that's how you can kind of tell the difference between that versus a compound. Compounds you can't break apart physically. They have to be broken apart using chemical methods. And that's how you separate compounds from elements. So these are some practice problems. And so we'll go ahead and make your stab about what you think is a pure substance, what you think is a homogeneous mixture. And then afterwards, we're going to check them on your next slide. So on this first part, our pure substance is definitely going to be the block of aluminum. It's made up of just one material. Blood is made up of a lot of different things. You have your red blood cells, you have your plasma, you have your platelets, right? There's all different things inside of there. Your air is made up of oxygen gas, nitrogen gas, water, carbon dioxide, argon. There's a lot of different things inside of there. And your orange juice is made up of water and vitamin C and sugar, right? And so there's a lot of different things inside of that. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about what a pure substance means, right? And so it should be just one type of material. In this case, aluminum is a little bit more straightforward because it's just aluminum atoms. And so that makes it even more special than a pure substance. It's an elemental substance. But you can also classify them as being a pure substance as well, because that's its larger category. When we're looking for an example of a homogeneous mixture, it's going to come out as air. Our sand kind of depends on your scale, right? And so you might have said sand, and that could be an okay answer. Now, when air came along, that was probably a better answer than our sand. And so sometimes what you want to do in these cases is choose your easiest or your most straightforward answer. And so that was something that we wanted to look at. And that's why I wanted to put this up as an example, right? And so for your exams and your quizzes, I would try to make it more clear. We won't try to have two of these options that kind of border on that line. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just want to make sure that you're choosing the one that makes the most sense. Right? Copper, on the other hand, while it's the same throughout, copper is all the same material. That's why copper couldn't be a homogeneous mixture. If you look on your periodic table, copper is there. It's element number 29. And so that's how you know it's an element. Sugar is the same material going all the way through. It's typically glucose. It could be sucrose. But sugar is normally classified as just one material going through. It's just the sugar. If we told you that you have a mixture of brown sugar and white sugar, then you might have a homogeneous mixture or a heterogeneous mixture, depending. But if it's just saying sugar, we're assuming that's the same. Let's think of an example of a heterogeneous mixture. So remember, heterogeneous mixtures mean that they are not the same throughout. And so when we're looking at that, we should have come up with chicken noodle soup. Chicken noodle soup, you can see the chicken, you can see the noodles, you can see the carrots, depending if those are in there. But things like seawater, steel, and milk, those all look the same throughout. Those are homogeneous mixtures for all three of those, actually. I like this question because this one is looking at your different materials. So we're talking about pure water here. We have lemonade from a powdered mix, right? You can kind of see in here, it's got a zoomed in version of it. And then you have lemonade from freshly squeezed lemons, and you're trying to see how you would classify those three things as being either a pure substance, a homogeneous mixture, or a heterogeneous mixture. So take a moment, looking at this one, how do you think you would classify them? Which one's going to be a pure substance? Which one's a homogeneous mixture? Which one's a heterogeneous? We should have ended up with this. Our pure water is going to be the pure substance. It's made up of just one thing, the water. Our powdered lemonade, though, that one's going to be a homogeneous mixture. As we mix it in there very well, all of our powder dissolves, and we should have the same throughout. Whereas our freshly squeezed lemonade, that's going to be a heterogeneous mixture. We can see those different pulp, right, and seeds separated inside there. It's not going to be uniform throughout the way that our powdered mixture is. And so that's what we're looking at for those. Now we talked about that we can separate our mixtures using physical transformation versus chemical ones. So physical transformations, what's different about them is that your substances should be in the same, they should be the same substance, but their physical state might have changed. So that could be like cutting up a piece of paper. You've taken it from one sheet into many smaller sheets, but it's still paper. The material itself hasn't changed. It could be like water being frozen into ice. It's still water, it's just in a different physical state. It's gone from being a liquid to a solid. Or if you evaporate water, if you boil water, you now turned it into a gas. Chemical transformations, on the other hand, they take that material, and when you go through a chemical change or a chemical transformation, you come up with an entirely different material with a different composition. So it's not the same compound any longer. So an example of that is sodium metal. When we mix it with chlorine gas, it can go through a chemical transformation and it makes table salt. Now this is pretty impressive because sodium metal is actually quite explosive. If you get sodium metal wet, it will explode with that water contact. Chlorine gas is poisonous, quite toxic to your lungs. And so both of those things don't seem like things that you would want to eat, let alone add to your food for flavor. But when we react them, they become this really stable form or this really stable compound called NaCl, right, or sodium chloride. And so that's how our chemical transformations can start off as two very different things to make a third change, which is a new type of compound entirely. Chemical transformations are a little bit easier to see when we start to write out chemical reactions because we'll be dealing more with our chemical formulas and you can see what the materials are being made up of. Okay? But the key part of a chemical transformation is that you have a different material from the beginning towards the end. Now, your physical transformations of matter. This is something that most of you might be familiar with, but if not, we're going to talk about them anyways. So there's really 4 states of matter, but we're going to focus on the 3 most common ones: solids, liquids, and gases. The 4th state of matter is called plasma, and that isn't something that we're going to deal with as much in this course, so you don't have to really worry about it. But if you wanted to know, it's basically about taking those material and then ionizing them, right? So solids, liquids, and gases, an easy way to tell the difference between them is solids have a definite volume and a constant shape. That means if you take them out of their container, they're going to hold the same shape. Liquids, on the other hand, have a definite volume, but not a defined shape. So liquids, when you take them out of the container, they still take up the same volume, so they're not going to fill the entire space that they're in, but they're not going to keep their shape when you pour them out. Gases, on the other hand, have no defined volume and they don't have a defined shape. So with gases, you don't even have to pour them out of the container. If you open the container and you move them around, the gases will escape and start to fill the space that they're in. Right? So they don't have a defined volume or a defined space. If you take a balloon, you can kind of squeeze that down. You can compress those gases inside. You can make them bigger or you can make them smaller. And that's the difference between gases and liquids. So people often say, well, how would you classify Jell-O? Is Jell-O a liquid or a solid or a gas, right? So if we think about this, if you take your Jell-O, and if it's well made, when you dump it out of the mold, it holds its shape. So it has a definite volume and it has a constant shape. So we would classify that as being a solid. Now it's a very weak solid. It's flexible. It moves things around, but it's a solid nonetheless. Now, while you need to know these states, we also want to know the names of the transitions between them. And so I like to use this diagram in order for us to tell. So when you go from a gas to a liquid, that's called condensation. A liquid to a solid is called freezing. Solids to liquids, melting. Liquids to gases, vaporization. And so if you think about it, a lot of this side we can figure out just from the water cycle. Water evaporates, so it vaporizes, it turns into steam. It condenses when it rains. Condensation on the outside of your glass is when it goes from being a gas to a liquid. It freezes when you turn water into ice cubes, right? Ice cubes melt when they turn back into water. So you can kind of use that as a way to visualize that side. And so you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the arrows, what direction they're going in. On the other side, the last section that we want to talk about is going to be this change from a gas to a solid and a solid to a gas. Now, those have a special name. They're called sublimation when you go directly from a solid to a gas, so no liquid in between. And it's called deposition when you go from a gas to a solid. An example of this is dry ice. The reason why it gets its name is dry ice is carbon dioxide as a solid, and it goes directly to carbon dioxide as a gas. That's what's making that fog as you go through it. Now, it's called dry ice because there's no liquid in between. So if you use dry ice to cool something, it never gets wet. In the same way, if you use a normal ice cube, as it starts to melt, then it gets everything wet. And so that's dry ice is carbon dioxide going from a solid to a gas, so it's subliming as it goes through that process. Deposition is actually really used in industry if you want to fabricate very precise materials. It's called chemical vapor deposition, but that's how they get these really thin layers of materials on top. So if you want to lay down a very thin layer of gold on your microchip, then you can use that chemical vapor deposition in order to make these really thin layers, so that way you don't have to use a lot of gold, and you can also make a very small microchip. So our physical transformations kind of go through a change in here. Right? Whereas our chemical transformations, that means that something else is going on. Now we can measure chemical properties. Those are different ways for us to measure chemical transformations. These chemical properties only occur when there's a chemical change. So that might be how flammable something is. So does it ignite? Does it catch on fire? But the only way for us to measure that is we eventually have to catch it on fire, right? That's how we can measure that. Now, some ways that we can tell whether we have a chemical reaction is you're looking for things that might produce smoke or light or heat, or things that have color changes. Now, just having color by itself is not enough to say it's a chemical change, but if you have something that's yellow and it turns to red, or go from blue to green, the only way it can make those changes is if it has going through a chemical transformation. So it has to be going through a change in order to go through a color change, because color has to deal with the energies involved. If it doesn't change its color, it may go through a chemical transformation, it may not. But if it goes through a color change, then you kind of know that there's a chemical reaction going on. The only exception to that is you want to think sometimes when things go from being clear to being opaque, so they might become whitish or hard to see through, that doesn't necessarily always mean that it's a chemical change. It might just be like the way that water turns into ice. It might just be creating a difficulty for the light to make its way through. So it takes on that opaque look where we can't see through it without actually having changed the name of the color. So we're going to watch this one, and I want you to think about whether this is going to be a chemical change or a physical change. Oh, sorry, let's go ahead and restart this one. All right, we're going to wait for this to look. But this is cesium metal being placed with water and phenolphthalein. And so we're trying to think if it's going through a chemical change or a physical change. So the cesium metal is going inside. And so take a moment, see what information you might be able to jot down about why you think this is a chemical change or a physical change. So it is a chemical reaction. You can see the air bubbles that get produced there. Oh. You can also see, right? So we have air bubbles there. You can also see that there's a change in our color. We've taken on this new bright pink color. And we might also be losing that piece of metal as well. It's kind of hard to tell at the bottom. We can't tell if it's still there or not. But we are going through a chemical change there. So our chemical reactions is going to be a big focus of what we're going to be looking at inside this course. And our chemical reactions, we always start off with what we call our reactants over here on the left side. That's our starting substances. And we're going to have our products over on the right. Now this arrow, that's eventually going to come to mean reacts to form, or is basically what's going on. So that arrow is basically where the change is occurring, the chemical transformation. This entire process, us converting from reactants to products, that's going to be our chemical reaction. Now, the other part that we want to talk about today is for you guys' lab, we are going to be measuring some things, right? So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth inside of your lab today. So I'm not going to take too much time to talk about it now. I do want to get into your sig figs part. So when you are talking about numbers, there's two types. We can have an exact number, which means that we know for a fact that it is that value. There's no uncertainty about it. And we can have a measured number, which is something that we get when we make a measurement. So we have to use some type of tool to get there. So an exact number has no uncertainty. It might be the number of people present. It might be the number of fingers on your left hand, right? If you're just counting them, then that's going to be exact, right? It might be 12 eggs inside of your egg carton. If it's a measured number, that means that you use a tool in order to get there. So that could be the length of a car. It could be your mass that you get at the doctor's office because you stood on a scale. It could be the gallons that you put into your gas pump. Right? Those are all ways. So you want to go through and think about whether these are exact or measured. And then we're going to talk about them, right? So number of pens in a box, that's going to be exact. We're going to be able to count those. Whereas the watts of a light bulb, that's going to be something that we have to measure. We need a tool in order to do that. Cups of flours for cupcakes, that's going to be measured because we can't just tell that by ourselves. We have to make sure that we use a cup, right? So that's our tool. And so that's how we're measuring it out. Steps you walk, that's going to be exact if we count them, but steps that we walk that's measured via a Fitbit is going to be measured because we have a tool in there that's making that count. And the reason why measured numbers have some uncertainty in them is that it all depends on that tool, how precise or how accurate that tool can be, introduces this uncertainty. Now, there's two other terms that we want to introduce for our lab when we're talking about this, and that's going to be accuracy and precision. Now, accuracy is how close your measured value is to the true value, whereas precision is the closeness that's made to each other measurement that you take. So for accuracy, you have to know what the true value should be. And we only have to have one measurement with that term. You use that to discuss things like percent error or yield. Precision means that we have to have at least two measurements because you have to be able to compare them with each other. We don't actually have to know what the true value is for something about precision. We just need to make sure that we can tell how far apart the spread of that data is. And so we use that to talk about spread or standard deviation of that data. Ideally, we would be both accurate and precise, but being accurate doesn't mean you're precise, and being precise doesn't mean that you're accurate. So this is like a visual example of that. If we're throwing darts at this bullseye, being accurate and precise means that we're able to cluster all of our darts in the middle there. If you're accurate and not precise, then that means that you're ending up with something like this down here at the bottom, where on average, you're going to get a bullseye, but sometimes you're too high to the left, sometimes you're too far to the right, sometimes you're too high, sometimes you're too low. Okay? You're kind of all over the place, but in general, you're pretty accurate. That means that you're going through the same process, but your technique might be a little bit, or is inconsistent. This one means that you're precise, but you're not accurate. That means that you have a systematic error that's going off. That could be something like your ruler. You're using the wrong side of the ruler, right? So instead of measuring in centimeters, you're measuring in inches. So you're getting very good readings, but they're all in inches instead of centimeters. So you're systematically making the same mistake. Sometimes precise can be easy to fix because once you identify what you're doing wrong, you can make that adjustment and you can fix it, and then you get accurate and precise. Sometimes the being accurate and not precise can be easy to fix because you just have to make sure that you start to behave more uniformly. You do the exact same thing every time. So it just kind of depends. What you don't want is to be this person down here in the bottom right where you're not accurate and you're not precise. Then your data is just all over the place. You're making way too many mistakes. It's really hard for us to get good data when we're like that because we have to improve how we perform as well as being more uniform in how we're performing that. In the next video, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about our significant figures. And so then we'll look at how we can do those calculations. All right. This will be the end of the lecture for today. The next one will be inside your lab. And then we will have another lecture again on for our next class.